Next up, we're going to review development. So this goes hand in hand with our industry development unit 6. So the big ideas we're going to cover is measures of development, Rostow's model, Wallerstein's world systems theory, the UN Millennium Goals, which are now the sustainability goals, fair trade, microfinance, and gender equality. So countries are grouped into 4 different categories based on HDI. And remember, HDI is that Human Development Index that was created by the United Nations that takes into account social, economic, and demographic indicators. So there's very high developed countries, so that would be like the US, Canada, Western Europe, Australia, Japan. We have high developing, medium developing, and low developing according to HDI. So again, according to the UN, every place at some point is at some point in development. It's a continuous process. And to measure this development, the UN created the Human Development Index. It has computed HDIs since the 1980s. The highest possible score is a 1. Nobody has ever scored a 1. A 1 would be like 100% developed. However, the highest countries in the world, like Norway, which has been the highest for several years, is always in like the 0.94s. So development is a function, again, of 3 different factors according to HDI: standard of living, long and healthy life, and access to knowledge. So that is things like GDP. It has things to do with like life expectancy and education levels. So the UN measures the standard of living through an annual gross national income per capita at purchasing power parity. So again, GNI, or gross national income, is the value of the output of goods and services produced in a country in a year, including the money that leaves and enters the country. PPP, or purchasing power parity, is the adjustment made to the GNI to account for differences among countries in the cost of goods. So decent standard of living. The average per capita is higher in developed countries because people typically earn their living by different means. So jobs fall into 3 different categories or sectors. We have the primary sector jobs, which are using actual natural resources. So that's things like farming, mining, logging, etc. Secondary, which is actually manufacturing. So that's mainly factory work, construction, that type of stuff. And then tertiary, which is service level jobs. So the contribution to GNI among the sectors varies between developed and developing countries. In the least developed countries, most people work in the primary sector. In the most developed countries, most people work in the tertiary sector. Part of the wealth generated in developed countries is to purchase goods and services. Especially important are goods and services related to transportation and communication. So every person should have access. Inequality adjusted HDI modifies the HDI to account for inequality within a country. The lowest scores in terms of inequality are going to be found in the least developed countries in parts of sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. A long and healthy life. Good health is an important measure. So the goal is to provide the nutrition and medical services needed. The life expectancy at birth is the HDI's main health indicator. With longer life expectancies, developed countries have a higher percentage of retired people and a lower percentage of children under 15. The UN believes that access to knowledge is essential for people to have the possibility of leading lives of value. So the things they look at are years of schooling. So how many years does the average student spend in school? And they also measure the quality of education, which is looked at through pupil-teacher ratio and literacy rates. To measure extent of inequality, the UN created the Gender Inequality Index. This combines multiple measures, including empowerment, labor, and reproductive health. So empowerment looks at the percentage of seats held by women in national legislators, so in governments, and the percentage who have completed high school. So labor, it looks at female participation rate in all different types of jobs. Reproductive health looks at maternal mortality ratio, which is the number of women who die giving birth per 100,000, and adolescent fertility rate, the number per 1,000 who are giving birth between the ages of 15 and 19. Gender inequality has declined since the 1990s in nearly every country, meaning that women's status has risen in almost every single country in the world since the 90s. So the US GII has increased, points to two factors. Reproductive rights are lower than any other country with very high HDIs, and the percentage of women in the national legislature is lower. So we score lower. We have a higher gender inequality than most of the other developed countries for these two reasons. Next up is Rostow's model of development. You definitely need to know each of the different stages, and you should be able to give examples of countries in each stage. So Rostow developed this in the 1950s, and he said that all countries prior to the Industrial Revolution started off in what he called the traditional society. This is when you haven't started development yet. There are no countries still in traditional society today. Obviously, there are some tribes in isolated places like the Amazon rainforest, but no countries. The second stage is called preconditions for takeoff. This is when progressive leadership moves the country towards greater productivity, mainly by investing in infrastructure like roads. Takeoff is when a country experiences something akin to an industrial revolution, where sustained growth takes hold, urbanization increases, things like this. This would be countries that are just now starting to manufacture goods. So a good bet is to look on your clothing tag, and those countries that you're starting to see make clothes like Bangladesh, Indonesia, Vietnam, Honduras, those places are in this takeoff stage. Then drive to maturity is when we start to see technology diffuse to other industries. So they might still be producing some textiles, but they're also starting to do other things. Good example would be China, India, Mexico, etc. The last stage is the age of mass consumption. This is when most people are no longer manufacturing, but instead are working in that tertiary sector. So high incomes, widespread production, majority work in the service sector. This would be countries like the US, Canada, all of the Western European countries, Australia, Japan, and so forth. Again, here is just a graph showing which stage and which sector most of the people would be working in. Next up is Wallerstein, who depicted the relationship between developed and developing countries, basically saying that in this increasingly unified, globalized world, developed countries form a core area, whereas developing countries occupy periphery locations. So he separates all of the countries into these three categories: core, semi-periphery, and periphery. Basically, the core countries are the most developed countries, periphery are the least developed, semi-periphery are those ones that are in the middle, and they all need each other for various different things. So North America, Europe, and Japan would be the core areas and account for the higher percentage of the world's economic activity and wealth. So we're where the capital, the money comes from. The developing countries have less access to world centers of consumption, communications, wealth, and power, but we use those least developed, those periphery countries, mainly for raw materials. And then the semi-periphery are the ones who are doing most of the manufacturing of those goods. So here's a map, though a little slightly outdated, with countries like South Korea, which would now be in the core, Bangladesh, which would now be in the semi-periphery. But for the most part, this is a good breakdown of who is the core, who's the semi-periphery, and who's the periphery. So leading up to the year 2000, the UN developed 8 goals that they called the UN Millennium Goals. They've now changed them to what is called the Sustainability Goals. But the purpose is still the same, to reduce disparities between developed and developing countries. So these are the things the UN has been focusing on: eradicating extreme poverty and hunger, achieving universal primary education, meaning elementary school, promote gender equality and empower women, reduce child mortality, improve maternal health, combat HIV and AIDS, malaria and other diseases, ensure environmental sustainability, and develop a global partnership for development. This chart shows the different ways that the UN is trying to accomplish these sustainability goals. So you definitely need to understand the fair trade movement, which was proposed as a variation of the international trade model of development. So commerce in which products are made and traded according to standards to protect workers and small businesses. So for example, when you buy Hershey's chocolate or Nestle chocolate. There's no regulation of people making sure that wasn't grown in the Ivory Coast by child slaves. However, if you are buying fair trade chocolate, there is regulation making sure it was not grown by child slaves. So fair trade products tend to be more expensive, but the purpose of it is to protect those people and workers in less developed countries. Also need to know a little bit about microfinance. So this is an alternative source of loans and small loans and other financial services to help people in less developed countries kind of kickstart development. So this aids in the development of small businesses. All right, so that concludes it for Unit 6, which was Industry and Development. The next we are going to cover is Unit 7, which is Cities and Urban Land Use.